Hello, so I'm here with Mac Macartney. Mac I've known for quite a long time. Mac is the founder of Embercombe, if I got that right, Mac?
That's right, yes.
That's right, and a speaker and writer in his own right. And we're here to talk about what motivates him as a leader and where he comes from in terms of authentic leadership. So Mac, if we can talk a little bit about sort of where you come from as a person. So what made you up as a person? Where did you come from personally? What was your school like? Give us a bit of an early potted history of how you arrived in the world.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I'm very glad to be part of this. Okay, well, I'm just trying to think of a truncated version, as it were. But let me just say, I was very, very fortunate to be raised by a couple of really quite enlightened parents, because I'm now 71, so I was born in 49, and I think my parents were unusual. So as an example, my father gathering us three boys together and informing us that since our mother, her job was at home, as was typical of the time, and since she was going to spend so long preparing the evening meal, it was incumbent on us afterwards to make sure we got her settled in the sitting room with a cup of tea or whatever she wanted, put her feet up while we went back to the kitchen and did the washing up. Well, we were rather resistant to this sort of message, but it certainly had an impact, and it wasn't an invitation, it was a command. At the same time, lots of wonderful time, free debate and discussion, ranging ideas, and as I got older, they absorbed the whole hippie uprising in their stride and allowed me to walk with them down the street with me looking like a walking, rather colourful bush, and all sorts of just wonderful. So they were great, and I remember them sat cross-legged with me in a circle with a group of others when I'm 20, in those days. So I think that was one big benefit. And then I had the challenge, and one could say misfortune, perhaps in the long run. There were benefits of being incarcerated in the boarding school for about 10 years. And I think that's where I learned an awful lot about the abuse of power, about the corrupt power, about this appalling juxtaposition of lofty ideals and Latin inscribed mottos that exhort us to be the best we can be, and excellence and all these sort of words, whilst very obviously not living it. And that included the school chapel, the assemblies, the whole thing. I did okay insofar as I survived, mostly through sport and things like that.
Yeah.
And but I was already pretty much lost, I think, to the establishment at that point. So when the whole flower power movement started, there was an awful lot that was attractive to me in that, insofar as it was a message and a vision of a better world, a fairer world, and a world with ecology and back to nature and all those sort of things.
Yeah.
And of course it collapsed, as we all know, because it didn't have legs. It was a vision without any sense of how to. But in many ways, I see everything that's happening now as versions or sprung from a similar vision, but now with far more capacity to do. So and I think, if I can just add this, and it had already found its way into an expression for me of the understanding that this was I understood life, if you like, from as having a spiritual dimension, as well as all the other dimensions of achievement and success and getting things done and all these things. So I understood very early on that nothing would make sense for me unless it included somehow my sense of reverence and awe and wonder, really, for the natural world. That's what led me to mentorship with indigenous people, and that they are the ones who then challenged me to make as much of a positive difference as I could in the various communities that I engaged with, and in particular at that time in business.
Yes. And I know that you spent about 20 years on that sort of apprenticeship and then coming into your power.
Yeah.
So speak a bit about that. How did that help with your sense of personal purpose and for you to be able to operate as a leader in this authentic context?
Right. So it's quite complex, Mark, in some ways. Very, very helpful. For the first time, I met people whom I respected, who affirmed my vision, if you like, of a life informed by a love of nature and a love of in the sense that we are here to learn and grow and leave things better if we have heart,
Yes.
And that demands that we continuously learn throughout our lives and negotiate our way around all the pitfalls that lie in wait of would-be leaders.
Yeah.
Not least the one that comes with success.
Yes.
Of succumbing to hubris and ending up believing that you actually are different from everybody else, and that all the privileges you enjoy that you've actually earned, which I think in many cases is not true.
Yes.
So they affirmed me in that way. Then it was an extremely challenging, so it was a rite of passage existing over many years. And I think I tested my boundaries. I didn't have any belief that I could write, and they insisted that I wrote. I was terrified of public speaking, and they insisted that I got up and started speaking in public. Nothing I said would ever deter them. In fact, it was like petrol on the flames, really, so it only made things worse as far as I was concerned.
Everybody needs a mentor like that, right?
Yeah, but in the end, it was very simple. They said, you love this earth, people and all beings, and you have to make a choice. You either stand, raise your voice, and courageously tilt into that vision, or you conform and settle around something that looks kind of okay, but actually, on your terms, is deep down failure. So it's very helpful. I should add, which is a rather terrifying aspect of this story, really, is that ultimately the main people involved who taught me were revealed themselves to be corrupt people. And that, I would say, when I'm asked at different times, who are the leaders that have inspired you? Mm-hmm. My first answer is I don't have such people. I have people who I believe betrayed the role and position of leadership they had. And I found it so appalling and so embarrassing and so sort of defeating to the notion that human beings, can be more than simply self-serving, self-seeking, that I just thought the bar is pretty low. I think I can do better than that.
That's really interesting, Mac. In fact, I share part of that sentiment. I don't think I've been betrayed in that sense in my own experience. But as you know, part of my early experience was in the military.
Yes.
In the army, you are taught a series of ideals about what leadership is and looks like and feels like and can be.
Yeah.
And I did experience it in the military, in honesty. Of course, it's a bit of an oxymoron to have noble leadership in a military establishment, which has always seemed to me to be a strange thing. Yeah. But I haven't experienced it since I left the army, which is very curious. And like you, I don't think I could name someone who's influenced me in that way.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting that we're constantly, I don't know, curious to your view about this, whether or not we're constantly on a treadmill towards these sort of hopeless ideals, or can we genuinely help ourselves in that way?
Of becoming, you mean of becoming, as it were,
Yes.
a truly authentic leader of integrity? Yes.
Yes.
You see, I don't think that. I think the ideal, if we, ideal is a pretty strong word, but let's say just a well-balanced person of authenticity with integrity, who does truly attempts to align their actions to the values that they have, and that those values are ones linked to being in service to present and future generations. You know, these kind of framed in that way, I would say yes, that, you know, that's possible, isn't it?
Yeah, hopefully.
Yes, and I think I have met people who I think are like that, but very few of them have ever held any position of leadership, or at least in the sense that we would understand it. They are leaders in their own homes or amongst their communities. And I don't think any of them have been perfect either. They've been normal human beings, but who, on balance, really do have some quite outstanding qualities. But they do exist. I've been introduced to people who apparently are this ideal, and every time I've got anywhere close, I've discovered that wasn't quite the case. And in fact, just recently was invited, would I like to meet this person? And I said, oh yes, I'd love to. You know, would you like me to connect you with them? I said, yes, that'd be great. And then back came the thing saying, your audience with so-and-so has been arranged at this time. And I thought, I don't remember that word being used before. And then I had an email saying, you're about to meet this preeminent spiritual master, and these are a few things you should know before you know, and arrange your questions. And all this has begun from, would I like to connect with this person? You know?
Yes.
So anyway, I sent an email saying, I've made these observations, and I think I will now cancel the appointment because you know, I've been through this before, and I don't have much interest in meeting someone who frames a casual whatever as an audience. Is it possible? Yes, it's possible. I mean, I don't know her, but Jacinda Ardern,
yes,
everything that I know about that woman makes me feel like, wow, like, you know, that is really quite stunning.
Well, yeah, I tend to agree with that. And my sort of follow-up question around this is linked to that relationship between true authenticity, absolutely staying true to oneself and one's values, and power. And I think we all recognise that in order to make any significant change at any scale, anyway, you either need to be an absolute disruptor and have enough resource to be able to do it in your own way, such as someone like Elon Musk. Mm-hmm. Or you need to achieve power through traditional channels and make change in that way. But that there's something happens over the course of doing that, which can ameliorate or limit those noble ideals that one might start with. Yeah. What observations do you have around that dynamic? And is it sort of doomed to failure? Bearing in mind, of course, we just mentioned Jacinda Ardern, but she's still quite young.
I don't think that it is doomed to failure, but I do think that it is true that very few human beings are able to achieve, as it were, exceptional success or success, and maintain and build and grow true integrity.
Yeah.
And that can withstand the enormous pressure of so many people telling you that you're great, or applying all kinds of privileges to you. And we have a tendency, don't we, all the time to sort of blow people up beyond where they're capable of being, and then they can never possibly live up to it.
Yes.
And most people are complex, you know, they may have many virtues, but it's quite likely they'll have some shadowy little place that's, once it comes under public scrutiny, is disappointing at least. So I do think it's possible, but that then brings that principle of what we call the twin trail. The twin trail of leadership, and coming from those mentors of mine who said we would never trust any leader who was not walking the twin trail, the inner path of their own self-unfolding, self-balancing, self-healing, self-awareness, ongoing throughout their life, which incidentally tends to be something we associate with doing when we're younger, and that we don't need to do it when we're older. In fact, I think it's probably the reverse of that, in that we may be not particularly inclined when we're very young, but as we get older, we most certainly need to, otherwise we'll become boring, tedious, self-opinionated, and ultimately perhaps corrupt, so that way around. So that's the inner path, and the outer path of real impact in the world. So that then comes to this idea, this notion we always use of these three questions of what it is that you really deeply and profoundly love, because believing that when you answer that question in depth over a long period of time, you define what is sacred to you. And then there's a pause, because you have to then decide, okay, I understand that. Am I willing to pledge myself to that? Let's assume we do, because if you don't, I think there's a sadness insinuates itself then from there on, because you know that somehow it didn't quite meet the challenge. The next question of what are your deepest and most profound gifts? So it actually separates that from qualifications and experience, but suggests that we do have some kind of innate seed of something deeply special and unique, which only we can offer this particular version of. And around our gifts should be, our work should be orientated around our gifts.
Yes.
Because then we will shine. And that's lovely, because it's unlike the martyr of just doing it and suffering. This then becomes intensely enjoyable, because you're doing what you love, you're doing what you're good at in service to what you love.
Yes.
And then lastly, what are your deepest and most profound responsibilities? And so hopefully that then takes you beyond the nuclear family, beyond the extended family, beyond simply human beings, beyond and beyond and beyond, into this much more profound place where you understand that you really have some responsibility towards all life, and certainly towards future generations, which is why, as you know, I'm so drawn to that Native American teaching of children's fire.
Yes.
Of making all decisions and all operations from any kind of business, test them against the idea of, will it in any way compromise future generations' ability to live in a flourishing and diverse and safe and beautiful world.
Yes.
So I do feel it's possible. Yes, I do. But just if we pause for a moment, because if we ask ourselves, what does our whole education system support us in becoming? And I would say, aside from a very brief flurry at nursery, we're then sucked into this machine whose sole objective, as far as I can tell, is that we should come out the other end having agreed to be good boys and girls, and give everything we have to give towards an economic system that is raping and pillaging the earth and making it weaker year by year. So, it's not much of a surprise. If we turned that round and adopted a different notion as to the purpose of a life, and said it was to garden this planet more beautifully in such a way that all species will thrive. And we will measure success and everything by other criteria, which are much more life-affirming.
Yes.
We'd have a totally different and a far greater likelihood of producing leaders who are of a different order.
Yes, I think that's true, and because we know each other, I know that your entry point is definitely, the ecology and the planet, and looking at it from that perspective, the natural world.
Yes.
And I've always been curious about the relationship between that and living an authentic career. So one of the questions that I'm conjuring with myself at the moment is, do you have to link what you're doing if you're trying to be an authentic person, authentic leader in that sense? Often when we talk to people of that type, they're probably middle managers in an organization. They might even be a first line manager, team leader. They're unlikely, the people who are focusing on those kinds of questions are unlikely to be the really senior people who seem to have had their lives sorted out, but nevertheless also display a lot of authentic traits. So are we now in a position where we need to really have that as a centrally held question? I'm thinking here about the climate change, about climate overwhelm, about grief around the climate, around the rapid acceleration of all the modeling of how the climate is actually changing and the pace at which it's doing so. Is that a necessity? Has it always been a necessity? Or is there still some time?
Well, honestly, I don't know. There are many people with many opinions. I don't know how they can be so certain. I have no idea. I don't think it looks good, and I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out that there is no time. Certainly from the indigenous people I'm still connected with, they talk in terms of it's not the 11th hour, it's the 12th hour. And,
right.
But I think for as long as there any uncertainty, and perhaps even after, when there is, let us imagine that there is certainty and it's not good news, we are still left with the question, how do I intend to live this life? So I don't spend too much time thinking about how things will be or whether it's going to work out or not. I ask myself, what am I doing today? Right now, what am I doing tomorrow? How am I caring for my family and my two children, one at university, one 3? How am I interacting with the person that serves my table in the old days when I used to go out for a meal? In all these things, who am I? There was something else I was going to say, but it's just escaped me for the moment.
That's fine. I guess the question I'm sitting with is that there's a lot of narrative out there in the media and on social media, which is around, this is a real moment in our history. COVID has obviously it's very dangerous and demanding in one sense, but in another sense, it's allowed and enabled a pause that could never have happened otherwise.
Okay, I see. Yes.
And in that pause, some people are trying to deal with a profound sense of overwhelm and grief and difficulty.
Yes.
That they have not yet faced into, but in this pause have had to in some ways. So they're kind of in an emotional transition. And what I fear is at the end of this pause is that everything will just snap back, because it's been relatively brief, 3, 4, 5 months at the most. Everything will snap back into the shape it was before, and oh, hey ho, off we go again, and back into the mortgage and the debt and the daily grind.
Yes.
The first is, let's use this pause to do something different.
Yes.
But for those people who are on that cusp, who are dealing or trying to deal with that emotional overwhelm and challenge that they're feeling, do I make a change? Is authenticity and living this purposeful life is that a viable, real option for them? Can they still pay their mortgage and get that done?
Yeah. Yes. Well, I'd say, we all say, I want to be happy. You ask people what they'd like, it boils down usually, I'd like to be happy. So then you ask, what makes us happy? There are innumerable people who have mortgages paid off and everything else who are not happy. You have people who have so little that it's very obvious they're not happy. But in the end, what really makes us happy once our basic needs are covered is all these things we're talking about, really, is feeling that this life had real meaning. This life was lived joyfully towards a purpose bigger than me or my own, my very small world. And this is an opportunity. Yes, undoubtedly, we are being presented yet again, I would say, because I think it's happened multiple times, but with a chance to see things more clearly than we might usually do so, and then decide whether we're going to take some kind of action. It is my hope that many people will feel that they have seen something, have been woken or jolted in some way, that they're prepared to take risks that they weren't prepared to do before. But does that mean that everybody who takes that step will be caught by a safety net? No, it doesn't, because that's just not the way things work.
Yeah.
But I do believe that when you make that kind of move, providing you activate all parts of yourself, in other words, you don't just leap without any thought whatsoever. You use your experience, your gifts and everything, but you apply yourself in the same way that a business applies itself to a seemingly indissoluble problem, but galvanizes itself in a way that something like COVID would do and produces results. We are capable of doing that, but we just have to be energized enough to believe it to be that important. I think many people will find their way into taking action and making changes that will be really good in terms of the joining the whole movement towards trying to make a real difference in this world, and will give themselves a much happier life. The thing is, we've been tapped on the shoulder by, if you like, by the feedback coming from the environment, and not just the environment, from our cities, from the in large, fewer and fewer people who are in massively rich and larger numbers, all the social issues that we have. This has been going on for so long, the climate thing has been going on forever. And yet it's only in the last 30 years that the most damage has been done in terms of carbon into the air and all these other things, and half the world's wildlife gone. The truth is, I suspect, is that we don't really care on the whole. We'll care when it comes smashing through the front door, but up to that point, if it's somewhere else in the world, we don't seem to care very much. And that is a failure of leadership, because leaders could choose, like we have now all these inflammatory things which are happening at the moment. Imagine now that the very small number of those leaders who create a calm and measured, loving narrative about what is happening and help people find the better part of themselves, bring them along. I mean, wow, this is so impressive when you see it, so wonderful. So I do feel that in these sort of times of big change, and people in those roles in the middle of organizations, the truth, this is another thing. I remember sitting in a classroom as a teenager, realizing that we had massive power, those of us who are sat, behind desks looking at a teacher. And in that moment, it manifested as this awful thing now, when I think about it. We started these humming riots, and humming would start somewhere in the classroom. you wouldn't be able to tell where it was coming from. Everywhere the teacher went, the humming would subside and would build somewhere else. They couldn't tell who it was who was doing it. And you could take the strongest human being and reduce them. I mean, it was awful. I mean, really, really not kind, you know.
Yes.
But I remember realizing it. So all these people, all of us who sit somewhere in the middle of organizations, who believe we're powerless, when the day comes that we put up our hands and say we're not prepared to do this, and then we will be threatened with losing our jobs or whatever, and typically then we might capitulate. But what if we didn't? What if the numbers were so big, they just said, no, we don't want to be part of it. We want to be part of an organization that is genuinely hand on heart, moving heaven and earth to create products or services or whatever that are really going to make a positive difference in the world. Why can't we do that? You choose to do that, senior management, and we are with you. You know, I mean, it would be so exciting, wouldn't it? It would be really, really thrilling.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've been investigating has been the sort of the upswell of people deciding to do that for themselves. So there's an organization called Biomimicry 3.8, and they do research into how to do things in alignment with the natural world. And they've done a bit of research that looked around and said, okay, so how much work is happening in this authentic, purposeful, caring space around sort of global projects of that sort? And they reckon there is close to 1 million organizations, not people, 1 million organizations working to change all of this. Right. And then you see it sort of spill out in the last 10 days, even around Black Lives Matter and that whole movement, and Me Too, and all of those things. When people get energized enough, you're right, they do take action. So for the ones of us who don't march but feel authentic or want to be more authentic, what advice would you have for them, Mac? How can we help them to take that step?
I think, first of all, of course, even a few years ago, an awful lot of people would imagine they never would march, and then found themselves marching with Extinction Rebellion, which is just amazing. So I think we should perhaps be careful about saying we'd never march. I would love it if we said, I will never eschew violence, it'll always be in a peaceful manner. And if I find that it's not becoming that, I will step away from it because I won't be associated with that. There's no getting away from the fact it doesn't necessarily have to be marching, but you have to become visible, I think. Otherwise, you're hedging your bets still. So I think you do have to become visible. And that means you may meet resistance or pushback, and it may be painful. Doing the right thing doesn't necessarily mean that you will be rewarded. You may, in fact, usually there will be pushback until and unless you are either able to manage that or enough others gather with you. I would just say to them, look, I mean, I feel that look into the eyes of, your children, should you have them, or just all the places that you've grown to love, places that you visited and love, or family, I don't know, and ask yourself, does it matter to you? And if it does, then you just have to say, I could be more courageous. I hardly know of anybody, very few people could ever answer that question. I've maxed out on that, I mean, there's always more, isn't there?
Yeah, totally.
And lastly, it's not a sad thing. That's the thing, you see. It's liberating. It's wonderful. It's joyful. It's such a good feeling when it's a little bit like with your partner when it's been with you for a long time, unsaid, and one day we say it. Whatever it is, usually will bring some sense of relief because you've come clean, you've just brought it through.
Yes.
I think it's a bit like that.
Yes.
It's an amazing time. It really is an incredible time, and it's many things kind of time, but it includes amazing and wonderful. And some ways, when things get ugly and dark, it helps us see the beautiful more. It makes us realize what we might lose.
Yes. Yeah.
And that could be helpful.
Yeah. And a lovely point to end on, but there is a final question that leaves me with, which is that to enter into this authentic space, it requires a degree of vulnerability. And in some senses, vulnerability is leadership, and leadership is about being vulnerable. Because, as you've just said, in order to stand out, you have to put your neck out. You have to mark yourself out in some way. You're proposing something different to what is. Is that also a liberation in terms of authenticity? Is that where the power of authentic leadership lies, in that vulnerability?
If it isn't all of it, it's a big chunk of it.
Right.
Because, who isn't frightened, of something, someplace? Yeah. Who has absolute self-confidence? Whoever that person is, they're probably a monster. It's an appalling idea, I think.
Yes.
Who doesn't live with uncertainty and ambivalence and all these other things? Trained to transmit and simply that it coming from us, it must be the right thing, as it were. As you say, leaders who listen, leaders who feel, leaders compassion, of course. Leaders who have wider interests and loves that go beyond whatever their profession is. I had dinner with Emmanuel Faber from Danone, and the most animated that man was during dinner, and he was loved, great company, was his love of mountains and nature. But he was such a humane person, and in it, I would say there was a vulnerability because he was being real, But I would say yes, but it's a delicate thing because, of course, you cannot. If it just becomes a question of indulging, do you know what I mean? And throwing yourself on the mercy of others, as it were.
Yes.
And no, so it's such a dance. That's why the training of leaders and all the rest of it, it's such a delicate balancing, but it does have to do with the whole person, emotionally, spiritually, physically, and intellectually, and then and a little bit like the martial artist, able to move backwards, forwards, sideways, because you're sat in a place of poise. You're not always on the leaning forward with your center of gravity a few meters ahead of you, as it were. But anyway, I think it's a big challenge, but it's also a wonderful thing to aim for. And if we can't get the whole way, I'm sure we can get a long way down that trail. Every step is important. Yes. Thank you so much. That's a lovely note to end on. I really appreciate your time. Thanks very much for joining in the project and for that lovely take on the integrated person who can take us forward. Thanks so much. Thank you.